So Charles has made like some. He's like a relatively old mapper. I don't exactly know how old, but he's been like he was like a mapper at least 10 years ago, and he's made some forum posts talking about movement. He made like a little MP3 podcast thing that he has on like his user page. And he made some mapping puzzles, etc. So most of what I'm going to talk about is like going to be from that old guide. Yes, he's the overflow guy. So from my understanding, the most basic idea of his theory is that changes in momentum make the player feel physical sensations, and the larger these changes in momentum are, the harder something is to play, and the stronger the physical response for the player. Something like that. So the idea is that like minor changes in momentum, so patterns which make up like kind of a smooth path with low spacing, are going to be more intuitive to play than something with really sharp angles and wide spacing. Now, some of you might already say that seems a bit counterintuitive, and we're going to get to that. But for now, let's just continue. So he's like, he in his old post, he split up sort of flow into 3 main categories: linear flow, oval flow, and drop-off flow. Drop-off flow is basically just slider leniency. There's like a funny picture on the guide that shows it relatively well. Post that in a second, or maybe Jordan can. I don't know.
Post it.
Yeah, I saw you on the thing. Okay. So yeah. Yeah, drop-off flow is literally just slider easy abuse. So if there's like a slider that's easy to abuse, the point where the player could start to not follow the slider anymore, that's like the drop-off or something. Not worth talking about much right now. The more interesting kind of thing is linear flow. So linear flow, according to Charles, is continuous motion in a certain direction. And it's, according to him, the most comfortable kind of flow. Because they're just sort of moving in one direction. Can maybe start a stream and then just like show an example that he also had in his guide. So one example was, a pattern like this. Ignore the low circle size. So in his guide, this was like an example of a pattern that he would consider comfortable to play, because the changes from 3 to 5, the change in momentum to go down is like very minor. You don't have to move super much. Cool, I can't move the circle. Okay, anyway. And because of that, he considered it to be like easy to play, comfortable movement, as opposed to, say, if I put it down here, something like that. That would be not as, the flow wouldn't be as smooth through everything, and so harder to play. Now, something that's kind of odd about this for nowadays standards is that most people will probably say that really sharp angled jumps are actually the most comfortable thing to play. And in Charles' old guide, there are almost no examples of like sharp angled jump patterns, like say stuff like this. There's just like no example of anything like that. It's only really patterns with wide angles and like relatively low spacing. It seems to be the case that probably in about 10 years ago or something, a lot more mappers were using lower spacing, and patterns in general were a lot more linear. So what most of them interpreted as comfortable or smooth movement was just like stuff that's basically arranged as if it's almost like in a straight line, like this pattern again, as opposed to anything that has sharper angles. Well, Okay, so that's linear flow so far. We're gonna encounter that term later again. Gonna talk a bit more about it. The next one would be overflow. So overflow is similar to linear flow, except that the player is supposed to play minor changes in exterior angle, which go in the same direction, more like a curve as opposed to stopping on each node. So if I make some kind of pattern like this or something. Oh, I didn't do it correctly. Cool. Basically, instead of just like moving in a line from object to object, Charles would say you're moving around more like in an oval around it. And that kind of flow is also relatively comfortable. It's basically kind of just like linear flow. And then also the other idea is that if I say I have a pattern like this, and then the next object is here, that object is going to be harder to play because this is all going in the same direction, and then here's a direction change. And the direction change makes it harder to play, basically. We're sort of going to encounter this idea again. And in some ways, Charles' idea of overflow might just be like a different term for another thing we're going to encounter later, which is circular flow. But yeah, that's basically Charles' theory so far. There isn't really much about it in terms of documentation, so it's kind of hard to interpret it, I would say. Like, when I tried to research some stuff about it, I just didn't find much besides that one guide and like the podcast. So there isn't much to say, and a lot of the ideas about movement might be sort of biased in terms of being just like inspired by very, very old styles of mapping. But yeah, I think it's worth sort of still going through those kind of ideas and then seeing how they develop, or how they have developed further. You have any thoughts so far, Jordan, or should we just
No,
move
I
on?
think Charles's theory is kind of an interesting thing to think about. There's like some other things. I know this does say this. There's some more information in the doc as always, because we don't always cover everything. But there is like some uh, reasoning as to Charles's theory in terms of handwriting, and
Oh, true, yeah.
even this does still kind of carry on into kind of modern mapping. And when I say modern mapping, I mean PP mapping. If you think of basically any fiery rage jump pattern, which is just like vertical jumps. Like there's a theory to say that that is easy to play because handwriting typically does contain more vertical movements than horizontal. So it's even though it might be outdated, it still does have some interesting things to think about in it.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, the idea that sort of like uh, all of what's comfortable in terms of movement and what's uncomfortable is sort of like based on handwriting. He seems to not talk too much more about it. He just kind of thinks that seems to be a good explanation. Um, Arguably, there's like it's there's something interesting about that if you're considering like how tablet players play the game, but when it comes to mouse, it's a bit different. Um, or maybe it's not. Probably is, but yeah, isn't
Probably
it?
does
Yes,
translate
kind of.
somewhat. I suppose like the it would be what's similar to like handwriting movements to a mouse player's wrist movements. There's probably some translation there, but there's like two different play styles. So some of this stuff, mouse and tablet players while they play the same game, there are differences in how patterns can be comfortable in one and uncomfortable in the other. It's like, for example, I believe we went over this last time, kind of the idea of cursor drift.
Mhm.
That's not really present in tablet players, but it is in mouse players. So there's just like these kinds of differences between the two styles of play uh, that you need to be like somewhat conscious of. Like some stuff will be comfortable for a tablet player and uncomfortable for a mouse player. Whereas, for example, I know it's a very common thing where mouse players can find it easier for flow aim compared to tablet players just because of how like a mouse is relative input whereas a tablet's absolute input. Anyway, I think we're
Uh,
getting a little bit off topic.
yeah. Well, maybe two more things to mention. So Yukino mentioned something kind of interesting, which is about how mouse players only need to move with their fingers vertically, while they need to use wrist horizontally. There is also just a lot of different things to think about when it comes to different play styles, like mouse or tablet. There are, or even people who play with tablets. Some who aim more with their fingers, some who aim more with their
Yeah.
forearm, more with the wrist, etc. Kind of similar thing with mouse, like say claw grip versus palm grip, etc. All those kinds of things kind of influence how movement works. And for example, if you look at what I have on screen right now, that most people would often consider um, beyond just like spacing. The green jumps, if they were sort of repeating those to be harder than the yellow ones, just because for most right-handed players at least, this kind of movement, that this diagonal movement requires you to move your wrist in a more uncomfortable way than this one. Like if you have a mouse or something and you just do the diagonal movement versus the vertical movement, you might notice a little bit of a difference. So it's kind of possible to take these things into account when mapping, although it's probably really hard to like make any kind of substantial theory on how to really do that. Kind of just have to intuitively get a sense of what's comfortable. I think it's most relevant probably for orienting sliders around. Like I don't know. I feel like maybe misremembering, but I feel like I always feel it's nicer to have sliders that go downwards than it's going upwards. Maybe that's just me. Do you have
Yeah.
any thoughts on them?
Well, I think it is. I suppose it's just kind of. I kind of have a weird opinion of this because the tablet area that I play on is so small. I don't move my wrist when playing. I only move my fingers.
Interesting.
So I kind of find all directions kind of comfortable to play with. But there is some interesting, even though it probably in mapping normally, unless you try to abuse this kind of thing, it will like naturally balance itself out. Just with doing different kinds of patterns, rotated, flipped, whatever it may be. It's kind of something you don't need to be so conscious about. But it's interesting to experiment with. Like, there's this interesting Miss Magius map, Feel Good Inc., that was mapped for 5WC, which was a map made for left-handed players. Like it only uses flow comfortable to left-handed players, and it only uses the right-hand side of the play screen as well. Um, so if you kind of want to see how this kind of stuff works, you could probably take a look at that map and see like how the patterning can affect different play styles. But unless you're intentionally trying to kind of abuse for a certain play style, you're probably not going to do it accidentally.
Yeah. Yeah, there's maybe also something which is not mentioned on the doc at all, but I guess right now is like a good point to maybe mention it, which is that um if for example if you're starting a map or something, or if you have a big break or a huge gap in rhythm, something interesting is that placing objects in the middle of the screen is going to be like the easiest to play. We're putting them more on the outer edges and the corners. Um, will make it a little bit harder. It's mostly the case because players tend to have like a tendency to sort of reset into the middle, and then, like say, if there's a huge break here, uh, they might just move the cursor in the middle, and if the object is here in the top right corner of the screen, they have to already move more as opposed to if it's here. Now, also probably think about that in terms of making the beginning of your map more comfortable. Might want to put objects more in the middle, but it's not that, honestly, not that important, I feel like. Or at least I don't really care enough about sort of making it nice for players to just always place it in the middle or the upper left corner. True.
You
I
got
think there was once a guide that's mentioned like which corners are probably harder than which other ones. There's
well,
like a bit
the
of a hierarchy.
there's a funny thing
Not
about
so
this,
much.
whereas the language someone speaks can affect what's more comfortable to play. Because
You
if
mean when I
someone
expect
speaks
something to go?
if someone speaks a language which is read right to left, such as Arabic or a language like that, the more expects objects to start on the right hand side of the playfield because they typically look at stuff right to left.
Mm, yeah. Now, in some ways, that might have a bit more even to do with reading than with like movement, but it's still interesting to think about. Okay. Anyway, so now that we talked about that kind of stuff, let's get to the probably most interesting stuff. So I don't know exactly when developments in theorizing about movement really happened. Basically, all I can really say is that after the guide that was like made by Charles 10 years ago, Weppers sort of or like probably spread around somewhere in the community, in the at least in the English-speaking community, and then people like either picked up on it and thought about it for themselves, maybe developed a bit on it, etc. Um, where I would just like to sort of start is around 2016, both Mo and Fat came out with their like long series on mapping with the tutorials and everything. And I think that's probably the what's it? Basically, they just mentioned like a kind of development on the theory that Charles had, or like maybe would even say completely different one. Um, Obviously, it wasn't like invented by them. At least I don't think so. Um, but it's sort of like the most known presentation of it. So we're gonna talk about basically what they talk about in the videos, which you could just watch on your own. Mo specifically has like uh two on just on angles, and then Pishivet has like one split up on uh jumps and one on sliders, etc. Yeah. Okay. So there's something wrong. Okay. Mm, so the first thing that might be worth pointing out is that Mo kind of starts out his video, but by sort of critiquing Charles's theory by saying, or by talking about how it's not really specific enough and how the idea that's sort of influenced by the movement is influenced by handwriting is not precise enough, and instead we should only understand the difficulty of movement in terms of momentum. Then specifically, he talks only really about linear momentum and angular momentum or circular momentum. Actually, no, it is angular momentum. Circular momentum isn't a thing, I think. My bad. Okay, so what one interesting assumption about the theory that they develop is that when objects are spaced far apart, most players will snap between them. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of what snapping is. Basically, if I have two or say three objects, the idea is that I go from this one to this one, I like accelerate, or I just move to it, and then I slow down to hit this one more accurately, basically applying force in the opposite direction. And then if you take that force that you applied in the opposite direction and move then down, you can use that to move down here to the next object. So you sort of momentum goes in this direction, and then you already when you get close to two, you're applying it into the other direction, and just continuing that into three. That's what snapping would be. I guess
So your
technically speaking, snapping is just going from here and then slowing down to hit this accurately.
it's not just slowing down, it's let's say going from circle one, moving towards circle one, slowing down before hitting it, and then pretty much coming to a stop. And then hitting the circle, then accelerating in the other direction. So like stopping on the circle is an important way to explain that.
Yeah. Now, so this and the way we can talk about the difficulty of stuff like that, if we keep sort of the snapping idea in mind, is if we think about things in terms of linear momentum. I think linear momentum is an actual term in physics, is it? Do you know, Jordan?
Um, I mean,
I
you
think,
could. It's not a specific term.
yeah, I think there's a wiki page for it, but I don't really know much about physics.
I mean, linear momentum would just be like the momentum is comprised of two parts. It's a speed and direction. So linear momentum kind of just ruins the definition of it because there's no
Yeah,
direction.
yes, that kind of makes sense. Well, okay. So anyway, let's talk about basically what would be like if we keep these assumptions in mind, what would be like uncomfortable or versus sort of more comfortable movement? Obviously, good example here would be, as I already said, let's say we start at 1, then we move towards 2, and then we apply force in the other direction, in this direction, and continue that downwards to 3. That would be relatively comfortable, as opposed to, say, if we take this pattern. A common interpretation might be, if we assume that the player is snapping, is you move from 1 towards 2, and then you apply force in the other direction to hit it accurately, but then you also have to go into the other direction again. And in that sense, well, in the earlier pattern, there was basically only two changes in momentum. Here there's at least 3, you could say. And then you probably have to also always slow down on the third object as well, in this case, and then in this case as well. So move towards momentum towards 2, in the other direction, then in the direction of 3 again, in the other direction again to hit it accurately. In this case, move towards 2, apply force in the other direction, continue force in the other direction to 3, force in the other direction again to hit it accurately. That's sort of the basic theory you can use to interpret a whole bunch of jumps.
Since it's
And then,
a little bit difficult to show without diagrams, I'll just show diagrams.
yeah, it's going to post them in voice chat. Yeah.
Yeah, so the arrows kind of show the momentum changes. So like on the first one, moving between 1 and 2, the slow down to stop and hit 2, it's the same direction as the movement needed to hit 3. So the slow down to hit 2 kind of has already started the movement towards 3. Whereas on the second one with the linear pattern, there's a speed up towards 2, a slow down to hit it, and then a speed up in the opposite direction. So there's more momentum changes.
Okay. So I'm sure a lot of you probably already kind of know this idea, but it's maybe still important to reiterate it. And now, instead of just talking about like a whole bunch of other examples of angles, obviously you could say that like if the angle is roughly speaking sharp, then it's comfortable. If it's more like getting closer to the 90-degree range, then it's getting a lot more uncomfortable to play. And everything beyond the same, at least according at least if we assume that the player is snapping. We will get into why into that assumption a bit more later, but let's move on to the next one, which is angular momentum. So angular momentum is also what a lot of people, at least in the past, have called circular flow, and what Charles earlier kind of has called oval flow, which is basically that if I have, say, a few more objects, maybe I'll put it 1-4. This map is actually slower BPM. So let's say I have a pattern like this. I don't know, roughly speaking, like a star. The idea is going to be that we can interpret all of these, all of the jumps sort of with linear momentum. We can say we move from this one, apply force in the other direction on this one, go to this one, apply force in the other direction, etc. But what's also going to kind of be the case is that there's a certain kind of rotation to this pattern. Like if you think about it, if you go from here to here to here, you're sort of moving like in a clockwise motion. Maybe I can quickly play it. Time to not hit it. Yeah, or and if I obviously would repeat this kind of pattern, I would basically be going in a circle. Or at least that's sort of how it feels like. Whoa, what happened? Could not be loaded. Nice. Well, I'm so good at this game. Anyway. Now, conversely, if we have, say, this object here, and we instead put it here, the idea is going to be that because this jump here is sort of breaking that the rotation, it's going in another direction, that there's going to be some emphasis on this object, or that it's harder to plate this one. Maybe I can make it even a little bit more obvious. Whoops. Take this pattern, just rotate it a little bit, and take the last object, put it over here instead. I don't know if it's like slow enough.
The last object there, like the 5 circle, it's breaking the rotation that all of the previous circles used, so it's getting some extra emphasis.
Yeah. You could say it's going all clockwise, and then I have to go counterclockwise, or it's sort of implying a counterclockwise direction in this one. Then obviously, this way, maybe this one could continue like this. Now, this pattern here, or the objects within it, imply like a counterclockwise direction, or rotation, I should say. So basically, that's the idea of angular momentum. Or roughly speaking, that's the idea of it. There's another kind of component to it, which is that, let's say I have a certain kind of pattern, and it's like, I don't know, it's like this. It's like, roughly speaking, like a triangle. And the idea is going to be, if I take another pattern, I take a bit, but stay with me. Basically, because the angles here are a lot wider than they are here, or the angles here are a lot sharper than they are here. And what this kind of means is that even though the linear momentum between everything should be the same, there's sort of a bit more angular momentum, or it's like faster. It feels a bit faster to move through this one, especially if, say, the player is like playing it almost more like little ovals or something. Like, you could imagine, instead of just the player going in lines from object to object, they're sort of going in like an arch kind of movement from like here to here. Maybe you can show it with like a slider. Like, the movement would sort of be like this, and then the other direction would go like this. Wish I had like some kind of tool that I could show it a bit better. But I hope you get kind of idea. Like, if you imagine that the player is doing like a little overs, they're going to move around a little bit more than they are here. Or they're going to it's going to feel like they're rotating faster around. It's a bit hard to say what that really says about whether something is comfortable or uncomfortable, or whether something is like getting emphasized. Arguably speaking, you could say, if you have a map with like really structured jumps, if there's an even sharper angle on something, it's going to add like or feel like something is a bit more emphasized if it's like a significantly sharper angle, because the player sort of very quickly is going to more quickly change angular momentum. Let me maybe give an example here, which is, let's say I have, let's say I have this pattern again, but with the one jump here at the end being like significantly sharper than all the others. No, I mean, besides this one being also just more spaced, maybe I could just overlap instead. Or do it like this. I don't know. It might be a bit more sort of emphasis on this object because the angle is just significantly sharper than everything else. Or maybe even if it's like here. Yeah, that is definitely going to be noticeable if it's like an angle this sharp. That's like... So you can kind of use that idea. I feel like it's not super important to really think about that. Although there can be some interesting things you can kind of do with that idea. You have any thoughts, Jordan?
Well, yeah,
on
I
this?
mean, similar to everything else when it comes to space and angles, if you kind of set an expectation, it will allow you to create contrast. So if you do use something which uses like mainly 60-degree angles, and then suddenly you're using something like a 5 to 10-degree angle, like a sudden angle change. While using a sharp angle, we have said is comfortable. Using a sharp angle can kind of help you do two things in terms of emphasis. Number one, it can make a larger jump easier to play. And number two, just the angle change itself can provide emphasis as well because it can contrast with everything else. Of course, a sharp angle change like this isn't really going to have the same effect in something in a map which is using like purely only sharp angles. But it's just like the reverse can also be said. If you have a map which always uses sharp angles, and then you suddenly use a wide angle, not only is a wide angle more difficult to play, but also it's like the contrasting angle use provides emphasis.
Yeah, it stands out as not just that it's more straining to play and thus adds emphasis. It's also just like it also visually stands out, and I guess maybe reading wise as well. There's a lot of different ways in which if you use a bunch of sharp angles and only occasionally use wide angles, that they are definitely going to stand out a lot more. Now, if you have a map where basically you're using sort of all kind of types of movement, like sharp angle, wide angle, 90-degree angle, blah blah blah, that's not gonna feel that super special, I guess, if you use a wide angle. Although it will still be sort of a bit harder to play, maybe, depending on some things we'll talk about later. Might not be. But yeah, just maybe to reiterate something from the first lecture, which I don't know, probably most of you haven't attended. But anyway, the idea is if something is harder to play, that's a way we can emphasize things. And then obviously whether movement is comfortable or uncomfortable has some effect on how straining something is to play. If something is more straining, then we can use it to emphasize things, like with wide angles if we assume the player is snapping. Okay. There's another thing we could talk about when it comes to angular momentum, which is let's say we don't want to change rotation basically at all. Now, a kind of bad thing about that, which I think we mentioned that after the last lecture, so not within it actually. But if you sort of keep the same rotational direction, the same angular momentum rotation for too long, that can be kind of bad for, especially for most players, because if they're playing the map sort of like rotating around in one direction, playing everything like the little arches or etc., there's gonna be a lot of mouse drift, and instead of starting sort of on the left side of the mouse pad, they're going to slowly drift towards the right or drift towards the left, and that's just really annoying. We want to avoid it at all times. Maybe I can show sort of an example map for those who might have missed that one. But that was can do, yeah. Okay, so this map, the idea, or there's like a kind of funny gimmick about this one, besides the big circles, which is that it's all going around in the same angular rotation. Maybe I can show a little bit better gameplay also with my mouse. I'm gonna use relax just to really show it.
So you can see, especially on this skin with the cursor trail, Basically, everything is moving in the same circular direction, and it's not
Yeah.
really changing.
And
It's
as you can
angular
tell, I'm
momentum.
already having issues playing like this with mouse drift. I'm exaggerating a little bit how you would play it. Like, if I was actually playing that, I wouldn't really rotate this much around. I would do much more like this. Abuse slider leans here a little bit. But some people do play like this, I guess. Yeah, anyway, I think you kind of get the point. So rotating always around in the same direction. Should have picked a Chinese map. Do Chinese maps do that they only go around in one direction? I don't feel like that's the case. I feel like they might even not establish any kind of like angular momentum at all. I wouldn't really say that it's a bad map per se. There's just like this thing about it that's like really annoying.
I mean, the only
What?
Chinese mapper I can think who does stuff like that intentionally is Pink Heart, but that's it. And it's not
True.
really to the extent at which it affects cursor drift.
Yeah, true. I mean, I think most Chinese mappers aren't like doing gimmicky stuff besides Hollow Wings, maybe. Although I could be wrong. I mean, a lot of them are more just focused on like doing fancy movement stuff based on like feeling and whatever. Man, you need to get some taste. Shut the fuck up. I know a lot of fucking Chinese maps. Oh, not me. What? To this. Oh, let's go. Okay. I'm not bad after all. Good to know.
Well, Fan Chen is
Only
the
Burak is back.
only Fan Chen is the good Chinese mapper. No one else.
True. True. Not even Hollow Wings. Or what? Hollow Wings Batman. But anyway. So, I mean, I guess this one was also a good example to just like show like how a player might play some like you can really see the idea of the angular momentum thing. But anyway, now because of some other there might be some other considerations as to why you wouldn't want to rotate always around in the same direction unless you're doing like a gimmicky thing, which is that I mean in general it's just kind of like not super interesting to play. And you're missing out on like using direction changes for example say emphasis etc. Yeah, I guess the main reason is that it's just really boring kind of movement.
Yeah, if you kind of follow the same kind of just the same rotation all the time, it's very easy to predict where the next object is going to be, and it's like not engaging to play at all.
Yeah. So now that we've talked kind of about well, nice song. Now that we talked about like you should change the rotation occasionally, how do you do that maybe without it being uncomfortable? Maybe you want to avoid it being uncomfortable, because just like spamming jumps like this around everywhere in your map, for whatever reason you might do that, and then suddenly going over here, you probably want to avoid that if you're making things comfortable. Now, even if you don't want to make things super comfortable all the time, might still be good to know. So there's a few things you can do, which is first one would be using a reverse, like say preferably like a longer one, I guess. Wow, that fits. And then you can just change the direction and go over here. Maybe I should make it shorter after all, just to show. So I was going counterclockwise, so now I can go clockwise, arguably speaking. Am I doing that? Yeah, kinda. So that's somewhat intuitive to do. Arguably speaking, one reason why this works is also just that the slider basically is just the rest moment. The reverse isn't super relevant. You could also just do this. And I feel like it would be somewhat similar, although Especially for players who maybe don't abuse slider leniency super hard, or say hard difficulties, can be a lot better to do this. Let's watch me get no, fuck it. Okay, next one. Next idea would be a rest moment like this instead. Like a 1-1 gap or something. I guess technically speaking, this would also work if it's like just a half beat stack. You must love this song by now, right? Hearing it again and again. Okay. Another thing that's possible to do, arguably speaking, is like changing rotation with a slider body. Now, I personally think that one is a bit of is more like copium than an actual way to change the direction. I don't know. Oh, that's slow. Slow slider velocity. Just imagine this is a full beat slider or something. I'm wasting
Make
time.
sure
Anyway.
it's perfect.
Yes. Sorry, I'm just like that. Okay, anyway. God, this is annoying to do. Maybe this was a bad example. I also have like a picture. Maybe you could post that one for me, or should I post it, John?
Could you post it?
Yeah, I'll do that.
I will just be back in a moment.
Give me a sec. Actually, I can post some more pictures. A sec. My God, it's not doing it. Okay, finally. So, for those who don't understand what the arrows are about, the green lines are sort of just like momentum between all the circles. The red arrows are the momentum or force being applied into the opposite direction. Yeah. And then, as you can see, so the rotation is sort of changed mid slider, and could then go the other way around. Next example would be you can change it through just like a normal slider. Again, it was going around clockwise. So let's say I put a slider here, and the slider is implying motion counterclockwise. Very slow slider. Okay. Sure, like this or something.
Yeah, if you do this though, you are kind of instead of putting the emphasis on the angular momentum change, instead the emphasis is just going on the slider.
Yeah. Another interesting one would be, let's say we have these terms again. A perfect back and forth like this kinda. Maybe I should just take the pattern and rotate it around. Well, I guess that's not quite what I want. Whoa.
Just horizontally flip it, or
Yeah, something like that.
oh, yep. One thing to kind of mention. I know this might seem kind of intuitive to some people, but just so it's been said, if you have a pattern and it has like a clockwise rotation to it, if you want to make it anti-clockwise, you can just either horizontally flip it or vertically flip it. So if you do, let's say, copy paste a pattern, let's say you have a pattern that repeats in your map, it's probably a good idea to either vertically or horizontally flip it when it repeats, so it has like the other direction of movement.
Yeah, like let's say I take this one. Oh, I'm so bad at this. Okay, look, amazing star. Rotation is like going. Maybe scale it a little bit, just to make it more obvious. Okay, in this one, the rotation is going around clockwise.
Yeah.
And then if I control G it, it's counterclockwise.
Yeah.
And then also, obviously, if I flip it, now it's also clockwise, I mean. Same with if I flipped it like this. Now, if you flip it twice, that's just like going to keep it the same. Or if you rotate it by any amount, it's going to be the same no matter what. The rotation of the within the jumps is going to be the same, because it's sort of all about like the angles relative to each other and not yeah. Okay. Now besides that, obviously, what you can just do is because all that really a direction change like this is wait, not this one. Because all that really is like just a bit more uncomfortable movement. You can just use this one to emphasize something. Or let's say all of those notes are like the same intensity, and then this one is significantly more intense. The change in direction, especially if I have like a longer pattern like this, that's gonna add some emphasis on things you have.
Oh, what Yuki said was kind of interesting. Like using a triple would kind of just be the same as using a stack, where you just stop momentum for half a beat.
Yeah, kind of, I would say. So like I could place a triple or maybe even a stream here. Something like that. Perfect pattern. Yeah, so I changed again. The green pattern has a different rotation than the orange pattern, but it's roughly speaking intuitive because there's like a big rest moment here with the stream.
A rest of movement, but not of rhythm.
Wait, you say rhythm? Oh, my bad. Yeah, there's a rest moment. Yeah,
Yeah.
basically. For stacks, I feel like they are too easy for a reg jump pattern, so it becomes hard, as you said.
Well, that's true, but at that point, why not just use, if you want that to be emphasized by a difficult pattern, you could just not make it comfortable. Like all of these examples are kind of ways to make change like angular momentum changes comfortable, but there's no need to always use these if you're able to kind of use that momentum change to emphasize something.
Yeah, I don't know if do you have like a good map with a good example in mind. Do you know any? It's not
Um,
super important that we have one, but
no, I can't think of any.
yeah, I feel like this is one of those like techniques that's so ubiquitous. You will like see it in, or you could technically speaking see it in almost every map. Probably not almost every map, but like a lot of maps will use this kind of stuff at least occasionally. Yeah. Now we can move on to some more stuff. So basically, we talked about most of the uh theory, most of the super like kind of basic theory about everything. You probably already all kind of know some of the stuff. Maybe not all, but I assume a lot of you do. Now, there are some. If we just take this theory to be that if you snap it, if there are certain objects on the screen, that the most intuitive thing is always going to be a sharp angle, uh, because of a direction change like that. Not direction change, because of the few changes in momentum. There are some. That's not not going to be right. There's like going to be some outliers, like say if we have a lower difficulty. I'll just open random one up. Let me find some circles. Actually, let's go to the normal. Like, is this pattern super hard? Because it's all like wide angles or like 90-degree angles? Well, not really. It seems to be the one way we could explain this is by saying, well, in lower difficulties, there almost isn't really any momentum at all, or like the momentum between objects is like super low. Like, if I just play through this, it doesn't really matter whatever the fuck I'm doing. If I'm moving this little, I could move almost around however I want. It could be sharp angles, it could be perfectly sharp angles, it could be anything. And because of the spacing, it's being so low, the rhythms being so low density, movement basically doesn't really matter at all. I can't really think of any movement that would be super hard on a lower difficulty for lower diff players. And because of that, I mean, there are also some other considerations of why you shouldn't use sharp angles, like the thing we talked about with the triangles and the equidistant patterns in our lecture on lower difficulties. The most intuitive thing is just to space objects like this, where they're like sort of in a straight line. Because it being like it is straight path, that's just the easiest to understand for the player. Yeah. Another one would be streams. You find a random stream map. Sure, I have one. Really bad stream map. Let's go. I'm sorry for the mapper who made this, but yeah, it's bad. So we could say, well, these are all wide angles, they must be really hard. Would be nicer if it was movement like this, right? Or something like that. Well, most of you probably know that this is going to be a lot harder, even though, well, I guess it's like cheesable in this case. But it's pretty obvious that wide angles are a lot easier when you're playing streams than sharp angles. Seems to be super obvious. Now, to explain that is a bit, or just doing it by talking about snapping is not gonna cut it. The sort of thing about streams is that players aren't really snapping between objects at all. Like when you think about when a player moves between these three objects, is he like moving to from 22 towards 23 and then slowing down? Not really. They're just like continuously moving through everything. So it's relevant to kind of bring up a distinction here that you might like hear about when you're like a tournament player or something, which is a distinction between snap aim and flow aim. So snap aim or snapping is what we talked about earlier, with where you move from one object and you apply force in the other direction to hit it more accurately. And flow aim instead is just moving through everything with continuous motion. Yeah, the continuous acceleration or speed or whatever. And because streams are like so dense, because the objects are so close together in rhythm and also in spacing, seems the most intuitive for players to just smoothly move through everything. A similar kind of thing is the case with like alternator style maps. Now I need to find an alternator style map. What's a good alternator style map, Jordan?
Makeruza.
What?
Makeruza.
May
Just actually search Make a Loser. Oh, you
I
don't
don't
have
have
it. It's I'll spell
bad.
it for you. Without the capital A.
Maybe I'll just find a random one in between.
I'll just search PPK.
True. Oh, sure, I guess that one kind of works. Not the best example. Oh, big lag spike.
There, make Caruso.
Make Karus. Oh.
This has some patterns in it.
Yeah, this one is probably the best one. So similar with streams, because all the objects are spaced really closely together, and because they are like you also need to click very fast. It seems to be that both of those things kinda encourage someone to instead flow aim as opposed to snap aim. Now if we think about maps with just, well, let me play it just for a second, just so you can kind of see. Yeah, anyway. Now if we think again about maps which have like more normal BPMs, like this one, it's 165. Kind of similar thing could be true if I make, say, the spacing super small. If I just were to place objects around like this or something. Actually, I have a better example. Around. Yeah, this one. In this case, because all the objects are sort of spaced so closely together, even though the player has to, arguably speaking, tap kind of fast, it's like 1/3 at 140 BPM. It should be around like 200 or something, I believe. Am I mistaken, John? I think that's
210.
210. Okay, so because of that, now if Fishy would have spaced it like this, obviously, or this, then the player would kind of like snap aim through it. But because spacing is so close, players are kind of encouraged to like flow aim through it and then snap to these. Maybe I think a lot of people would snap to these, although if you're like really really good, you could, I guess, flow aim all of it. And then obviously he can do kind of fancy stuff here, like here where he's sort of like the flow does, because this is one of the only snap aimy patterns. It like stands out a lot. And I think here, although this one is going to be larger spacing, I'm gonna get a little bit more into this in a second, but it's probably not the case that a lot of people are going to snap this one, even though it's relatively large spacing and it's like high BPM, sort of because of everything that's happening around in this section of like the context of everything. But for now, let's skip a little bit over that. I'm gonna get to it. What else was there? So maybe something like the spacing is really high, but the BPM is still normal, or the BPM is like alternator style or something.
That's Atmosphere.
Do you snap that? No.
No, I flow aim it.
Yeah. Well, probably also because it's like, actually, it probably has mostly to do with spacing. Like even in a map like Atomosphere, where the BPM is relatively, where you have to like kind of stream or alternate through these patterns. Because the spacing is so high, nobody is going to snap aim this. Or I guess if you would be snap aiming this, you would be like, that would be insane.
There's one thing like really important to say about all of this discussion, which is when we're talking about flow aim and snap aim, we're talking about different play styles, so it's going to affect different plays differently, kind of like how the mouse and tablet discussion. So if a player has this speed to snap aim this, then they most likely would, but most players would flow aim it.
Yeah, imagine if you had the skill to fucking snap that. Then there would be a lot of emphasis. Imagine. Okay, anyway. So let's get actually besides these like things we've talked about so far, let's get kind of into a bit more about how context might matter when it comes to this kind of stuff. So actually, it's kind of a good example here. So earlier we said that we basically should assume that the player is almost always going to snap something. Actually, this is not a good example. I understand now. Anyway, so earlier we said a pattern like, say this, how that's uncomfortable to play because the player is like speeding up towards 2, then slowing down, or not slowing down, applying force in the other direction, and then they have to apply force in the other direction again, or in the same direction as here. And because that's more direction changes or changes in momentum than this one, it's harder to play. Now, we could just analyze this in terms of flow aim. We could just say the player is moving from this object completely through towards 3. They just know the right speed at which to move, or something like that. This kind of opens up the question as to when do people decide to snap versus flow aim? And it seems to depend on a whole bunch of shit. One thing we talked about is that, again, really high spacing seems to encourage people to rather snap than flow aim. So a lot of people would probably, in isolation, snap a jump pattern like this, as opposed to one like this. And then maybe also conversely, a lot of people, depending on the BPM, like say if something is 220 or something, they might even flow aim a pattern like this. Kind of. Like you can sort of do it. Maybe test it out right now. If I can sort of pretend. Yeah, kinda. You can kinda see it, what I mean, I think. Like I'm not really snapping through it even though the angles are like sharp. So yeah, spacing was one factor. Another one is sort of like the context of an entire map, kinda. So the one we looked at earlier, the emerald one. No, that one is not the entire map. Like there are some sections earlier. Or I guess it's also the sections earlier. Like a lot of stuff here kinda is flow aimy / sort of alternator style-ish stuff. And then later when we get to the section, because a lot of the jumps are arranged like this, there's just a general expectation that you're sort of going to flow aim almost everything. Which will sort of encourage players to even flow aim stuff like this, even though it's like a little bit more spaced, maybe. But because sort of everything around them is like encouraging them to try to flow aim most of the patterns, they might even flow aim stuff that they usually wouldn't. Like if you put this pattern into a different kind of map at the same BPM, maybe a lot of people would actually snap between it. Yeah, maybe another. Let me think of something. Oh, another interesting example is earlier we talked about like how angular momentum going sort of constantly in one direction is like the most kind of comfortable thing. There's even an kind of an exception to that one. What the fuck? So this is a demonstrator who's is mostly known for making maps that have like constantly the same kind of rotational direction. Maybe even to a detrimental amount. Some of his like really early maps. This map is kind of different though, because a lot of the jump patterns are sort of like this. As you can see, almost nothing here has like the same angular momentum. It's all, yeah, it's basically all back and forth or zigzaggy things at sharp angles, up and down mostly. Now, if you ask someone, is this map super uncomfortable to play because you have to constantly change directions everywhere, or there's no rotation anywhere? Probably most people would say, nah, not really. Now there's maybe a question: is this map harder to play than a map that has like a really simple, really simple rotations around everywhere? Maybe, kind of hard to say. Seems to be the case that because everything has like sharp angles everywhere around here, that's still really easy to snap through. And the players is sort of just like getting accustomed to everything being zigzag stuff. So because there are so many kind of patterns like these, the player gets used to it. Yeah, so that's one way, or another way in which kind of just like a lot of patterns being a certain way in a map kind of breaks some of these concepts we're talking about, or like it depends a lot on just how consistent you are. Could also be it could be an interesting question whether some pattern which has very obvious like rotation in this song, if that would maybe stand out or something. Kind of like this one. I feel like that one might actually be a little harder, although it could be because of the change in angle here. I feel like that one is harder in context compared to this one, personally. Although I could be wrong. Do you have anything to say about this kind of stuff, John? Any?
No, not really. I think you went over all of it.
Yeah. Let me think about something else. Okay, let's look at another kind of example, which is sort of maps that just have like a lot of low Amy patterns everywhere. Let's say we look at some last A map. I'm looking for a specific one. What? Don't have the fireworks one. Actually I do. Fuck. Wrong map. Okay. So good map. This is a good map. So this map, again, it has like a lot of wide angle jumps, especially in parts like these. So interesting thing here is that although a lot of players nowadays are sort of accustomed to everything being like sharp angle stuff, so when you randomly put like a wide angle jump in a map that has sort of sharp angle jumps everywhere, it's going to be kind of uncomfortable to play. In this case, it seems to be that because almost everything is sort of like a wide angle kind of thing, or there's like a lot of wide angle jumps, players encouraged a lot more to flow aim everything. Or there's, again, you get sort of creating kind of expectation for the player to flow aim more.
I know it's not.
That map is awesome. Fuck you.
I
Sorry.
know it's not in the doc, but just because you brought this map up, maybe we should quickly go over anti-jumps.
I actually wanted to talk about that in the lecture on more advanced stuff. Because I feel like it's more advanced, but I mean, there are a lot of anti-jumps in here, I guess. So maybe I can just quickly mention it. So what John is talking about is kind of stuff like this, where it's a big jump into a small jump and a sudden change in momentum. It's like making this one still hard to play, even though it's slow spacing. That's also kind of a thing that a lot of people combine then with like a linear angle. And in general, a lot of people use that in these kind of like flow aimy maps. Yeah.
Yeah, so similar to how kind of like wide angles are difficult because a player has to slow down, stop, hit an object, speed back up. An anti-jump or like a drastic change in spacing can be difficult because it means a player has to suddenly change the speed that the cursor's used to move in. If you have a large jump and a lot of speed, a player has to stop to hit the object and then suddenly not move as fast as they were before to hit the next one. It's kind of like that change of control, like the cursor's momentum having to be controlled so much, changing like moving lots of different kinds of speeds can give emphasis as well, even if it's not huge spacing.
Yeah, and well, I guess I'm gonna slightly change topic, or maybe change topic back. But like the main thing I'm kind of trying to get at is that sort of like the context of a map kind of matters here as to whether something is going to be snap aimed or flow aimed, and whether something is going to be snap aimed or flow aimed is like going to be relevant to judge whether it's uncomfortable to play or not, or like how uncomfortable it is. Arguably speaking, Floim is probably still kind of like harder for most people nowadays, but I think that's mostly because there aren't as many maps that have like hard Floim. If Floim was like the PP meta or something, and everyone was doing it, then maybe people would get worse at snapping or something. I don't quite know if there's like something that makes snapping like inherently easier, or if it's just that like because everyone is playing like that right now, it's like the easier thing generally speaking. Um, but beyond that, also, I think if a map has a lot more wide angle kind of jumps, it will encourage or discourage a player a lot more from snap aiming, and then also the inverse. If a map has almost only sharp angle jumps, it's going to encourage the player to snap aim wide angles as opposed to floor aiming through them, even though floor aiming might technically speaking be the easier thing to do. Can maybe even go so far as to say that a map that has like a lot of flow aim kind of patterns that encourages the player to flow aim a lot could maybe even encourage them to flow aim things that they usually wouldn't. I guess one good example would be uh, or some semi okay example. Like most of the patterns in this map, you kind of flow aim through them, right? Because it's like alternator stuff. I guess some things are maybe a bit ambiguous. Like maybe the player would snap to free or something. Hard to say. If we go a bit later into the map, there's also then stuff like where is it? Oh yeah, like this one. So as kind of mentioned earlier with say the triangle, now these are technically speaking sharp angles. But the player is you could sort of interpret it as the player still kind of like flow aiming through it. Like I don't know if it makes really sense to say that they are snapping it. Could maybe they kind of do. Maybe it's like something in between. Kind of hard to say. Another interesting example, or maybe better example, even would be a lot of maps by say Junsan or aka Evil Elvis or Uberzolik. Uh, Uberzolik specifically, like showed me an example, or I asked him for one. Where is it? Oh yeah, I think I can find it here. Yeah, so like say a pattern like this one. Even though it's like again like another example earlier, it's like kind of spaced, but still and it's the sharp angle thing. But because of the movement of everything around the map, everything kind of being flow aimy, some players might actually instead of snapping through those, they might flow aim it. Maybe play it. Yeah, kind of. Maybe some people would still snap it. Could probably do that.
I
Yeah,
think
although
maybe
feels
a
more comfortable.
I think maybe a more visible, like a more noticeable example might be on Rampage. Um, on the extra difficulty. Do you know the one with the stupid top diff? It's the irreversible map. Oh,
I don't know if I have that one. I can download it. Oh,
yeah, this on the 5-star extra. It's the one with the feet background.
God damn it.
So yeah, it's like this kind of idea is like clearly visible on the Kaiversibles extra.
Right.
The extra.
Kaiverse is excellent.
Where it's kind of like all flowing.
Let's see if. Alright, stuff like this, for example.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know who would fucking snap that.
Well,
I guess technically speaking, you can do it. Probably if you're like maybe a high, more. If you're like a top player, you might actually snap it. I don't know. But definitely kind of encourages people to flow aim more through
I
it.
think if
Just
this
because
pattern,
everything so far is flow aimy.
because everything is flow aiming, a player's encouraged to flow aim that pattern, which makes it a lot easier to play. Whereas if that pattern were to appear in a map which wasn't using as much flow aim, and then that pattern suddenly showed up, then a player might be more inclined to try to snap it and end up missing.
Me play this like everything is. I must snap everything. I can't even do it. So like streams.
Yeah,
I look just like a really bad player.
if that suddenly showed up in like an alt map with some like sharp angle, if a player's been encouraged to flow aim snap a pattern that's easier to flow aim, then it just makes it more comfortable to play.
Yeah. Now, something that also matters a lot, and Jordan kind of mentioned it earlier, is that this is going to be very different for different kind of players. Now, for example, obviously we talked about spacing earlier, how that might encourage or discourage someone to snap or flow aim. Now, what's like really spaced is going to heavily depend on how skilled you are. Damn it. So let's say I go back in here into this map. And I'll just put down some jumps. Is this really spaced or not for someone? Arguably speaking, I guess I would say for me, not really. I think I could flow through that. Maybe if it's more like this, then almost nobody would like snap through it, or like this. If it's like as spaced as this, I would probably snap that. Now, an interesting thing again is that some players, for example, actually Ubersolik himself, he sort of has mentioned to me that he plays just a lot of like flow aimy maps. Or in general, he's just like really good at flow aim, or yeah, he just plays maps like that a lot. So he's also kind of unlike a lot of players who play more conventional maps, just a lot more comfortable flow aiming through really large patterns, like for example these. Maybe not like spacing that's this large, but say this large or something. You would probably flow aim through it as opposed to snap it. And then conversely, there's probably a lot of patterns like say this triangle where he might flow aim through it, even though it kind of makes it harder almost as opposed to snapping through this. Now, in a case like this, if you can flow aim through this, it probably makes the or kind of makes the pattern easier to play in a way because you don't have to change momentum so many times. But if you but in this case, obviously, if you snap through it, that seems to make it a lot easier than flow aiming. If you flow aim through it, you have to kind of move at a really fast, like you have to rotate really fast around it, and there's probably a lot of
Yep.
sort of wasted movement you're doing. Like you have to do a big arch around here or something.
So while Uberzolik might like flow aim some of the larger patterns, one thing to mention, because we gave a description as to what makes snap aim hard, it's like lots of different or lots of momentum changes. What makes flow aim hard is a control of speed, and that usually gets harder on smaller circle sizes or on larger spacing. So it's like the more difficult it would be to control speed to hit objects makes flow aim harder.
Yeah, and as mentioned earlier with angular momentum, we can also apply the idea of angular momentum to flow aim. Well, I guess it wouldn't be angular momentum, it would just be like, I don't know. I mean, the basic point here is that, as you can see, the sliders are sort of like the path a player who would flow aim would kind of take around to play them. Obviously, in this case, the curve is like a lot sharper than here. So while if you snap patterns which are like really, really sharp an angle, those are oftentimes the easiest to play. Like the sharper the angle, almost the easier it is to play. Maybe with the exception of stuff like this, like perfect back and forth. That's maybe a bit different. But if with Floem, the opposite almost seems to be true, where it's the more linear a pattern is, the easier it is. Like in this case, this will probably be a lot easier than this kind of stuff. And then what this also shows is that no matter whether you floor aim or snap aim, squares, or I guess specifically just singular 90-degree angles, those are almost always going to be hard to play when the spacing is really high. No, these are also the most ambiguous in terms of like, do you snap through them or do you floor aim through them? I think even a lot of people nowadays who are more used to snapping might actually flow aim through something like this. I don't quite know
There is
how like most people play
there is actually
stuff
something
like
that
that.
some players do when playing squares. It might be getting a bit off topic, so maybe we can discuss it later.
No, please mention it. Actually,
So it's kind of hard to explain, but just I'm just gonna draw it.
can you maybe screen share and draw it?
Um, can you scroll forward in the timeline a little bit? Not that far. Like where I can see 4 objects. There, okay. I'm just gonna quickly draw it. Where players will almost kind of, when they play right angles, almost still have some kind of overflow through them, but whilst snapping to kind of fake sharp angles. And this is something that some players do. I know I do it. It's kind of cheating somewhat,
It's kind of
where
cheating.
they'll kind of draw an arc between, so it's not really as flow aim.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's how I play square jumps, and
Something that's also
that's how I play some wider angles as well, where I'll kind of almost cheese the angle into making it not feel as wide.
something that makes this also even more, now that makes squares now even more interesting to me is that this kind of makes even the direction, the rotation of a pattern like this kind of more ambiguous. Like if you would instead do arches outside, then the pattern is clockwise, but the way you're doing it, it's
I
almost
suppose
more like counterclockwise.
like arches outside would be how someone who's playing this with flowing would play it, but creating arches inside creates snappy aim.
Mm, yeah, squares are really interesting. And also, there's something that's kind of interesting about them as well, where like it seems to be the case that like full squares with 4 circles are almost sometimes easier to play than just like stuff like this, where it's just 3 circles. into maybe something else. I don't know if anyone else gets that impression, but I feel like a pattern like this is a lot harder than wait, what the fuck am I doing? I feel like a pattern like this is a lot would be a lot harder than just squares. Well, I guess there's also direction change here. Wait, no. Well, yeah, there is. My bad. Okay. What would be without direction change? I guess it would be like this.
Yep.
Wait, no, that's that's still a direction change. Rotation change. I say direction, but I mean rotation. It's going clockwise. So where the fuck is the next object go when I want to go clockwise
Rotate
again?
it by 90 degrees and then move one in the top right corner.
Like this.
Well, that's 180, but that still kind of works.
Yeah, whatever. Getting sidetracked. So maybe one last thing to mention kind of about the context sort of stuff is that again, we talk kind of about how the player skill level or the player's like tendency, so what kind of maps they play, how spaced something is, the context of the map generally speaking, all those kind of factors factor in how whether something is snap aimed or flow aimed, and whether something is comfortable or uncomfortable. Another, or maybe one last thing would be sort of the kind of meta context around what kind of maps are most played. As I mentioned earlier, most people nowadays, or most maps nowadays are like sharp angle jump spam everywhere. So most players are more skilled, more accustomed to snap aim as opposed to flow aim. Flow aim is more the rare skill. I guess I think even if you're like someone that plays a lot of stream maps where there is a lot of flow aim involved or alternator style maps, I think you might still be like worse at snap aim than someone who really focuses on it. Okay, see ya, Jason. As one last kind of like thing I want to talk about. Oh, soon. Okay, maybe you will catch the end. So the last kind of thing is little bit off topic, but maybe it's still kind of connected. Which is if we think about all the stuff about angles a little bit less in terms of like sharp angles are always the comfortable ones. The difference between whether something is a wide angle versus a sharp angle becomes less like about just the wide angles always being harder and therefore giving more emphasis, and more about them just feeling kind of different. So what a lot of people might do in maps is that they make most of the jumps sort of like sharp angles, etc., and then they use wide angles for emphasis on something. Say I make this random pattern here, then I have a wide angle at the end. Look, my wide angle, that's the harder one to play, it has emphasis. Maybe if they want to keep the intensity the same, they might make it lower spacing or something, because it's harder movement. But what else you could also do, if you make a map that explicitly has like a mix or mostly wide angles or something, instead what you can express, instead of expressing different kinds of intensities with angles, what you can kind of express is just like something feeling more I don't know, sharp, impactful or short versus more flowy, smooth, wide. I don't know. I think you kind of get the point that like instead of one just being distinctly harder than the other, just kind of feels different, and you can use that to interpret the song in ways as well. Yeah. Now there are like my mentor back when he taught me about some stuff. He kind of liked to put angles into instead of going by just how sharp or how wide something is exactly, sort of splitting them into or categorizing them into 4 distinct categories, which would be obviously sharp angles, wide angles, so both of these kind of types can be, according to him, used for almost anything to sort of kind of express just the song generally speaking. They will, if you use both of them a lot or only one type of them, they won't stand out a lot. You can just kind of express the intensity of the song relatively well with them. Oh, it was actually 5 types, my bad. It wasn't 4. So the next two would be perfect back and forth. So stuff like this. Perfect back and forth, as we said earlier, has kind of this interesting property where, because if you place objects down like, say, this, there isn't really a direction or a rotation to them. You're just like going back and forth between objects. And that can obviously be used to change direction in a comfortable see here, Jason. Besides that, apparently a lot of players also find really repeated motions, like when you go back and forth a lot of times, really awkward or uncomfortable in a kind of distinct way. I've never really experienced that myself, or it's I guess kinda, but like I've just sort of heard players say that repeating a lot of back and forth motions, that's uncomfortable in a way that's different from just the angle being sharp or wide. Now, I don't know. Can you speak to that? Do you feel like that's harder?
Yeah, the reason why I think that's hard is because almost when you do play a pattern which has some kind of like rotational change, it's kind of a lot easier to account for any mistakes that you may have made in aiming the previous objects because you're changing to a different momentum. But with a back and forth, it kind of requires almost extra precision in hitting it because you're just moving back and forth between the same momentums and there's no kind of like angular changes that kind of help you kind of reset your aim. It's kind of hard to put into words. I hope other people
Yeah.
understand what I said.
Yeah. No. The last two would be, or I guess, let's go to the basically the opposite kind, which is a perfectly linear angle. Now, that one also has this property of it not going in any direction really at all. And I guess in a way he could maybe even use this to sort of reset like angular momentum. What would be like a kind of pattern? I guess if you had like an old style map, like let's say I had something like this or whatever. Could say that's like the most comfortable way to sort of change rotation in a flow aiming kind of pattern, especially even if it would be more spaced. This is also why like direction changes in streams like this that are sort of super smooth, why they almost don't add any emphasis at all if there's like no corner on anything. Just changing direction just doesn't really do much. But we're not gonna talk too much about that right now. So something interesting that my mentor also kind of mentioned about angles like these, case that the last object receives more emphasis compared to the previous ones. And that also like it's almost as if the object in the middle of like say a pattern like this is like almost de-emphasized compared to the first and the last one. The way I kind of would explain that is that if you're flow aiming through this one, assuming you do, then you're kind of just going one big motion from 1 to 3, and 2 is just kind of happens to be in the middle of that. And while you move through, you just click on your keyboard. While with an angle like this, you do have to sort of slightly change where you're going in terms of movement, as opposed to just flowing over to and clicking it. Now, if you were to snap it, then in a way 2 would be the most emphasized, or I guess 2 and 3 would have like the same amount of emphasis. Like you move from 1 to 2 and then you have to stop and then suddenly go into the other direction again, which is kind of uncomfortable. So yeah, those are like 2 different ways you could interpret perfect linear angles. They can, I feel like, they work very nicely if you say you have a pattern in the song where the pitch is gradually increasing between 3 notes or something. I even kind of have an example of that. Might not actually be that the pitch is changing how I think it does, because I'm really bad at recognizing pitch. But here would be an example. Where is it? Yeah, like this one. I feel like that's a good way to express an increase in pitch, because as I mentioned before, if you flow or encouraging the player to flow him through it, sort of like they speed up over time, and the last note is the one with the most emphasis. In a really old map of mine, that's also kind of bad, I guess. I also tried to do some very weird things with perfect linear angles. What was the artist again? I guess I can do this. Oh, fuck is it? Oh, Felt was the artist name. Yeah, it was this one. So this, I kind of did like a thing here where there's some like symbols in the song that stand out a lot, oftentimes, and almost always they are the last note in a perfect in the what's it, in a pattern of perfectly linear angles. We maybe find one. Yeah, like this one. This is this has the symbol, and I'm sort of emphasizing it just by being the last note of this like angle here. Any other ones? Yeah, like this one here again. The symbols are sort of on here, and this is where it's the last one of a grouping of linear angles. And I guess there's also like a direction change here. Those are some interesting kind of ways in which you can use this kind of stuff. Here's another one. Yeah, like here again, the symbol. I almost accidentally did an anti-jump here. Damn, so bad. Wish I should have done this. Old Celektus should have done this. But he was too bad to realize it. Okay, anyway. Now the last of the kind of types of angles on the list are 90-degree angles. As we sort of talked about a little bit earlier, they seem to also be kind of special in various ways. They seem to, whether you snap aim or floor aim, they're kind of the hardest to play. And then there are these many different ways of playing them, like doing arches inside the square or outside the square, which is going to change what kind of rotational direction the pattern has. Yeah. That's basically it. We're sort of done talking about moving between circles, I hope. anyone has learned anything from this, or if you have any questions.
Yeah.